Now, what's been kind of lost in this intrigue about the diplomacy struggle is the program, the leaks itself. When Snowden came out in The Guardian and The Washington Post and said, well, the NSA is scooping up all this data, internet traffic overseas, phone records here in the U.S., I don't think people understand what that means. What does the NSA do with this stuff?
I think the assumption was NSA was picking up all this data and looking at everything. And that's not really what this is about. Certainly there's a question as to whether or not the government should be compiling this data. But the reality is the NSA is trying to gather all the hay for a haystack to then try to find the needle in the haystack related to terrorism. And so what they do is they acquire this data, they retain it, and when they have suspicions about a terrorist account, an email account, phone number, etc., then they ping the data. And they want to see, for example, if they have an email account for a known terrorist in Waziristan in western Pakistan, who has he been communicating with? And they'll look into that data to see where they have connections. And that then creates the analysis that they can then probe. They're not just trolling. They don't have time for it, frankly. There's too much data. And secondly, there are legal restrictions as to what they can look at. And so there has to be a terrorist nexus. And if it's a U.S. person, they then have to go and get separate authority to look at the communications. I think most people don't understand those limitations. And I think it's important to understand, if we're going to have a real debate about this program, you have to understand the current limits on the program because they're real. The limits are real. And in fact, the limits actually in some ways blind us to some connections. And I think that's worthy of some discussion.
And just as we wrap up, put on your legal hat here for a minute and explain to me in real people terms, if you can, why isn't this a violation of privacy? Why isn't this an invasion of privacy from a legal standpoint?
From a legal standpoint, what you have is the U.S. government seeking authority from the FISA court. This is the court established in 1978 to oversee these kinds of programs, the intelligence programs and gathering. And so it's a legal request approved by a court, overseen and authorized every 90 days to acquire this mass amount of data. But it does not target American citizens. There are minimization rules with respect to if this information touches an American citizen, that puts it in a completely different category, and there are all sorts of restrictions and rules as to how that applies. So the acquisition is legal, it's overseen by a court, and there are limitations onto its use. Now, some would argue we're in an age of big data and new technologies. That's not good enough. We've got to have other mechanisms. But under current law, under the FISA Modernization Act, under the FISA court procedures, this is all being done legally.
And just getting my phone number then doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment.
No, I mean, these are business records. I mean, the reality here is that the commercial entities hold, whether it's the phone companies or the internet companies, hold this data for their own purposes, for business records and otherwise. That's all subpoenable. The government can go get that given the right authorities and given the right oversight. And that's the authority that the U.S. government has been using. And frankly, it shouldn't be shocking to folks. This was in the debate in 2007, 2008 about the Modernization Act and what the government not only had been doing, but what it sought to continue to do under the law. And so, you know, I would argue that people need to pay attention a bit better if they want to be a part of this debate. But secondly, if we're going to have a debate, let's make sure we understand how the program actually works.
There's plenty more about this. We'll have to talk about it a future time.
That's great, Bob.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.